presentation by Professor Dziwenka. His presentation is titled "The Great Learning as the Historical Basis for Taekwondo as an Instrument for Peace." Dr. Dziwenka is a 7th grade black belt, and he holds a PhD in East Studies from University of Arizona, and he's also editorial assistant for the Journal of Adolescent and Adult Literacy. And he is also affiliated with the History Department at Salisbury University, United States. And of course, you all know that he is also co-founder and the president of the International Taekwondo Conference for Bennington. Let's begin with Dr. Dziwenka's recorded presentation.
My topic today is the great learning as a historical basis for Taekwondo as an instrument for peace. Great learning, or Dashi, is a 7th century BC chapter in the Book of Rome. It became a standalone text very well. The text is a basis of classification and core text of the so-called third classics, gospel, of each nation working together, and the core of civil service exam, curriculum, and only change was in kind. The great learning has informed political and cultural philosophy in East Asia throughout history. It also encapsulates and describes the stages in the process of ultimately achieving world peace, beginning with the individual self-determination, the formation of the world. I have 2 theses. The first is, the great learning should have been Chironi's foundational doctrine for informing and guiding his moral cultural and economic conceptualization. The second is, great learning can be a template for the joint effort of IOC, WT, and IDF as they apply Taekwondo as an instrument for peace. Chironi's moral culture of Taekwondo, where has consistently applied classical Confucian, Neo-Confucian, and Taoist teachings as the core justification of the moral culture of Taekwondo conceptualization. This moral culture aligns precisely with the foundational concepts in and spiritual cultivation process of great learning. I looked at selected quotations Chen and calligraphy June in his Encyclopedia of Taekwondo, Volume 1, 1987, as representative of his moral culture of Taekwondo conceptualization. However well intended, Chen does choose quotes from historical texts, but he does very haphazardly, in some cases willingly, in how he uses them to promote his moral culture concept. But in other cases, he used, misunderstood, or selectively translated other quotes. Chen and FWT don't hold great learning, but they should. Why apply great learning for peace? Chen always sought Taekwondo as a vehicle for a more peaceful world. iACT's Taekwondo Times magazine's motto is uniting the world through martial arts. WT's envisioned objectives is to promote, expand, and improve worldwide the practice of Taekwondo in light of its educational, cultural, and sport value. IOC's fundamental principle of Buddhism #2, Buddhism is to place sport at the service of the harmonious development of humankind, promoting a peaceful society. The mission of the IOC is to promote Buddhism throughout the world. IOC's work #1 is to encourage and support the promotion of ethics and good governance in this world. The IOC brokered a WTF-ITF alliance. In 2014, these 2 organizations signed a protocol of agreement and it outlined areas of mutual cooperation. They have done a number of activities since then, brokered by the IOC. Cookie 1, its official conceptualization of the common spirit, is from a 2015 research done by Hughes on Chen. Overcoming himself to the enactment of the 5 tenets of Taekwondo by the official practitioner is toward the ultimate goal of benefiting the world, other people's role in the better society. This is the idea of Mediterraneanism concept of public income create philosophical and it is the fundamental basis of human learning. In fact, ITF and WT have concocted a slogan: peace is more precious than time. So let's look at the text. Page 14, there was the first calligraphy by General Che. He translates this as: Taekwondo means to achieve courtesy, integrity, perseverance, self-control, and dominant spirit. These are the 5 tenets of Taekwondo, of course. My comment is that Jonshin, the 2 characters in red, are spirit. This term is not used in Che's translation. But he does use me and he. These are 2 of the 5 foundational concepts of Confucianism that I'll talk about later. Page 17, English text only. Jerry writes, Confucius declared, it is an act of cowardice to fail to speak out against injustice. Yes, Confucius did that in the Allan 24, but that was in the context of ancestral spiritual worship. If you see what is right and throw it out there, you lack courage. My comment is, this excerpt from the Allan is at the very end of chapter 2, which is on government, but it refers to ancestral worship. Well, it seems out of place there. It also seems out of place. It is the only place in the Allan in which this type of excerpt exists. It has nothing to do with what translates. It is taken out of context by Che. Calligraphy number 2 on page 17. Che translates this as pursue one's own wisdom. There it is in Embodied. It is translated as, my will is bound together in one continuous term, or nai dao, in a way that is consistent. My comment is, this excerpt means to pursue a personal moral self-cultivation is the center of the discipline. The claim faith that Che puts is right next to the English only sentence. It is an act of courage to fail to speak out against injustice. Che grossly mistranslates his praise for applying individualism, and that it is a martialized against injustice. And that is not what it is. Calligraphy number 2, page 41. Che writes and translates this as life and work become one. The textual translation, in context, is the numerous things are regarded as one substance. Today's explanation in English of this is, I myself am not only another student participating in a narrating learning process. I've come to define the spiritual dimension of Taekwondo as fusing oneself with the ideals of Taekwondo. If we consider ourselves as one with Taekwondo, we will respect it as we respect the bodies. My comment is that this phrase is a new concept theory of one origin, and all things come from the material concept of rejection. Che interprets this individualistically, but it actually means all things are one substance. Page 45, English text on theories. Confucianism said, the sense of morality, one must treat others with faithfulness and sincerity based on righteousness, and to eliminate completely vicious thinking. This is not found only in the Allan. This is not possible whole that it doesn't exist. Page 45. There is the quote that I just said about thinking, fraternity, workers, or characters. Che calls them moral culture. What is moral culture is actually spiritual self-cultivation, which is a Neo-Confucian spiritual cultivation term, is a Neo-Confucian term that is appropriated from Buddhism. But Che uses this as playing or implying his moral culture. This is the 12th century Neo-Confucian concept, appropriated from Buddhism, and applied to the Neo-Confucian process of moral self-cultivation for the benefit of the entire world, which is what we're going to learn about. Page 47, English text of Che writes, Confucius said, virtue is like the North Star. All of the stars revolve around it in a wonderful fashion. Each star connects to one. It's very good translation. First, around the virtues from the Jusa, Shinsa, or Gunja. We're all they lead and try to be virtuous like them. A virtuous and true Confucian leader is a model for everybody to follow. Page 46, calligraphy number 5. There is Che's calligraphy. Che does not give a translation of his quote, which is on the concept of virtue and riches, and he does write about it in a number of pages in the book. Che Che writes in relation to this phrase, "Be virtuous. It is difficult to define what virtue is, but it is the 5 human qualities: humanity, righteousness, courtesy, wisdom, and trust. We must constantly cultivate and practice these virtues, and actually they are for the betterment of society." Well, this political theory Che comes from the mentions. There it is in red. But the context is the mentions. The scholars cultivate their personal character and become illustrious in the world. Here is the exact translation. If a scholar is poor, the scholar tends to his own virtue. If a scholar is advanced in dignity, the scholar makes the whole world and the kingdom virtuous as well. So, like the quote which Che uses refers to how Confucius culture act. But Che writes about being virtuous as enacted by virtues of Confucianism. However, it is a very liberal reading of this phrase, and it seems to be uncommon. Poetry number 6, there is Che's poetry. On page 49, Che translates this as, "The heaven is not for any particular person, but it is for everyone." Thus, it's a very good translation. Everybody has individual personal responsibility for the whole of the world, all under heaven. We should be number 7, iACT characters. There they are. Che writes when he translates that as humanity, righteousness, piety, wisdom, and trust, respectively. These are the 5 constant foundational virtues without neo-Confucianism. So Che is clearly looking to appropriating Confucianism's entire moral structure as his moral culture of Taekwondo. Here is a very interesting English open text on page 26. It's comparing the Taoist movement to Confucian movement to a legalist movement. The first is the Taoist movement. The ideal society for Taoist is one in which a leader is of such high moral character that he can rule naturally by appealing to the nature of his people. So, Che is alluding to the fact, to the idea that Taoist rule is one of high moral. Next, a moral society is one in which the people are and praise their work that it professionals and their disposition bears. This is a Confucian movement. Thirdly, there's a legalistic society. So, Che explicitly is referring to chapter 17 of the Confucian. Here it is. The best of all rulers is their shadowy presence to subjects. That's a Taoist movement. Next comes the ruler of things. That is a Confucian movement. Next comes the word here, that is a legalist movement. This is down in chapter 17. When Taoist ruler is personality of a Confucian movement. A Taoist ruler, when his task is accomplished and his work is done, people would say it happens was naturally. Very different from why was Che the Taoist text of denigrating Confucianism? More importantly, why is Che grossly misrepresent the characteristics of an ideal Taoist ruler by stating that high moral character? Actually, an ideal Taoist ruler is by a shadowy presence. Let me look at a lot of chapters in Che on the Taoist ruler's characteristics. Chapter 2, the Taoist ruler who never knew the people. That ruler empties their lives and fills their belly. Reaches their ribs that strengthens their bone. He always keeps their faces of knowledge. That's a critique of Confucianism. The Taoist ruler does that which consists in taking no action and ordering people. So this is really the chapter 13 of the Confucian. The pursuit of truth is more every day. But in the pursuit of glory, one does less than one does less and less until one does nothing at all. And when one does nothing at all, there's nothing that is left undone. Well, a Taoist ruler does nothing, does do. Taoist ruler is always to not memory looking at Irish money. Should you meddle with or let people to the task of doing the input? Well, a Taoist ruler does not meddle in the people, but Confucian ruler does. Chapter 22 of the Confucian. The sage embraces the one and the one of the room. How is he alone? He does not show himself, and so he is defeated. He does not consider himself right, and so he is illustrious.
The second floor is just one big room.
It is because the Taoist ruler does not contend that nobody in the party is in a position to contend with him. So that by doing the wrong will, by doing the way, the scholar who is very shy when he comes into his subjects. He is not a high military, children service, rather than rational. So let's look at the breakdown. It is a short text. It has broken into two parts. There is the very first line, and there is the very last line. The very first line introduces the first half of the book, of the text, which is on how to control people from the top down. It is the very first line of the first half of the Great Learning. The way of the Great Learning involves manifesting virtue, meditating people, and embodying methods of the spirit. And then he talks about the top down movement. The end line ends up with how each person must be cultivated through introspection. So this is, from my perspective, the second half of the chapter. From the sun of heaven down to the rest of people, all must consider the cultivation of a person as the root of human science. That is the last phrase, So let's look at the first half of the text. The ancients who wish to illustrate the message's virtue throughout the world, first ordered about the unfair. Wishing to understand, they first regulated the family. Wishing to regulate the families, they first cultivated the persons. Wishing to cultivate the person, they first rectified the people's hearts. Wishing to rectify the hearts, the people first sought to be sincere in their thoughts. Wishing to be sincere in their thoughts, the people first extended to the utmost the knowledge. Extension of knowledge, laying the investigation of things. So, to regulate a state, the individuals must initially first investigate the things. Let's go from the bottom up to the second half. When it's investigated, knowledge becomes complete. When an individual's knowledge is complete, their thoughts are sincere. When their thoughts are sincere, their hearts are rectified. When their hearts are rectified, their persons are cultivated. When their persons are cultivated, their families are regulated. When the families are regulated, the states are rightly done. When the states are rightly done, the entire world is at peace. This is the entire text of the Bennington. Good learning depicts the foundational practices of Confucianism and Neo-Confucianism, informing political and cultural philosophy stages throughout its history. It connects individual self-cultivation through investigation of things to world peace. This text encapsulates the paradigm practice of Chinese iACT, world cultural Muddle, which should have cited as the foundational text. Peace is an express goal of the iACT, Q1 and ITF. So, the great learning should be the historical and philosophical basis for Taekwondo as an instrumental movement. These were precious and triumph, and Allan, it's on the ground, Thank you very much for listening.
Next, we have again recorded presentation by Professor Allan Bäck of Youngsan University in Pennsylvania, United States. Dr. Bäck received his doctorate degree in philosophy from University of Texas at Austin. And he has published widely in many aspects of philosophy, including philosophy of sport. To explain the Taekwondo, his presentation is titled A Taekwondo Model.
Greetings. Here I'm stuck in COVID country. And thank you very much for inviting me to your meeting, and I'll try not to disappoint you too much. So I basically just follow all of this. This book is called a Taekwondo Model, the problem we have to run through breakdown thing. The history of Taekwondo has become quite controversial. The traditional account has Taekwondo having a long history of many centuries in Korea. Koreans, and indeed many other practitioners of Taekwondo, take great pride in this history. The Republic of Korea is seeking from UNESCO to make Taekwondo a real functioning 1930s. For that to happen, Taekwondo must have a long history. The traditional account of Taekwondo history, it was claimed that Taekwondo has been existed since Korea's Kingdom period and has passed down to the present day through various incarnations of names such as Subak, Hornbach, and Taekwondo. Hornbach, like its successors, was a hybrid form developing the Subak and its core, including techniques of the Chinese Shaolin martial arts and Japanese karate. One of the more common ways Korean martial arts researchers give credence to their theory is the existence of the Seokko and Gata and Warrior strategies. Taekwondo, thanks to the Hapkido and other Korean martial arts, all have claimed these as proof that their practice is ancient. The Order of Young states that real opinions in Lulu's tomb, number 3, in the Lulu the Bäck songs I got my Korean Sura show similar positions to these used in Taekwondo's offense and defense, and in fact depict the movements of Taekwondo. He claims that the supporters of Taekwondo have distorted the truth between legitimacy of being the heir of traditional Korean martial arts. But he does see this long history, that's the point here. However, the more recent historian, who's called realists, say this: it's turned out that very little evidence to support a long history for Taekwondo. In reality, these statutes have no relationship to martial arts. Archaeologists have discovered these relatively common images across East Asia, from India to China to Korea. They actually portray common Buddhist guardian deities. Although controversial, at least in Korea account, this realist account claims that Taekwondo originated from Funakoshi Shotokan Karate Do and some Chinese martial arts. The realist viewpoint espoused by both Kim, Louis, and Stephen explains that Koreans learned karate during the 1905 and 1945 Japanese occupation of the Korean Peninsula. Some Koreans learned Chinese martial arts as well. These individuals who studied in Japan returned to Korea after the end of the Second World War and began teaching Kangsudo or Hongsudo, which is, this is the way that Koreans pronounce the Chinese characters for China hand or empty hand, which is the standard names for karate in Japan and Okinawa. Those is what many Korean expatriates teaching martial arts in America, which we learn their styles as Korean karate, because it was easy to sell to people like Americans. They only adopted Korean Taekwondo later. What was being practiced in the years in Korea with after liberation was actually Shotokan karate. And Moody's pretty clear on that. Thank you, Professor. The third framework of Taekwondo for the history of it attempts to synthesize the traditional and realist viewpoints. It accepts the realist claim that modern Taekwondo does not have a long history in Korea, but rather derives mainly from Japanese Shotokan. However, it also accepts the traditional view as a real cultural force in Korea. That is to say, part of a culture consists in its myths and traditions. Many members of the Taekwondo community today accept the traditional account, and so it has social force today, and they need to be accommodated. That is, cultural and traditions are historical facts too. People find this valuable to give them revelation and exemplar. And neo-traditionalists will seek to approach and reform current martial arts practice in terms of the values and goals presented in cultural traditions today. One of the troubles with the current research, my opinion, of the world is also the traditionalists is focused almost exclusively on physical techniques. At the same time, practitioners of Taekwondo proudly assert the existence of Taekwondo philosophy and the profundity of its code. The presumption seems to be that these materials are original and indigenous to Korea. I just give you the codes. These are several Taekwondo codes. And some of those you probably familiar with. Confucian virtues of Japanese food. So you look at, say, what the Confucians say, pretty standardly. Here are the Confucian codes, and they have the Confucian virtues. And then these particularly here, which end up in more of the Chinese codes, seem very familiar, seem very much like the Korean ones. And again, this is Muddle, as names of the Chinese code. So again, this is still Confucian. You don't have time to read two books anyway. Again, the Japanese, notably Shokan code, seems to be influenced by samurai traditions, but also the Buddhism, which in Japanese martial arts is explicitly embraced. So, here they have 5 principles here, which again seem very much like the Taekwondo codes. And we have various interpretations of these codes, which really sound more familiar to us, I think. Alright, so that's sort of the model that we have all this evidence now that the physical techniques of modern Taekwondo, at least at the start in the 1950s, was pretty much Shotokan, and the kits of Shotokan, and the form of Shotokan. And so what we do, I first propose we should study the codes and culture of Taekwondo in the same way as the physical techniques are studied by the realists. As you face the facts, do historical research, and reasons went to Japan to study martial arts, would have been exposed to these things, and most likely they would have incorporated them into their training and teaching upon their return. It's possible that it didn't happen that way. Why? Well, because sometimes people are foreigners are taught, and only the basics are only part of the martial arts. A good example of this is in Okinawa, when the American airmen were taught by Okinawans. Okinawans who practice karate. And they didn't teach them anything but the basic exercises that Funakoshi was teaching school children as he was a school teacher. They didn't teach them too much of the other stuff, like pressure points. You see, so it might be like that, but it's most likely not. Particularly for Koreans who advance pretty far in martial art, and also because it's sort of posted at the front of the dojo, along with the shrine. So, and I think that Korean studies in Japan would have been exposed to this material. And again, later on, as Koreans spread out through the world and bring Taekwondo to the world, they would have run across these codes in places like Europe and the United States. So, I still don't want to debunk the traditions of Taekwondo. I don't want to debunk the code. I don't say it's useless. I think that we should do this. I like to see a traditionalist approach. I sort of persuaded Dr. King to do a little bit here. Anyway, I propose keep to the facts, but also give the reality of myths and ideals. Like other cultural practices, martial arts evolve. Since the Japanese occupation, Korea has changed greatly. Inclusion of the Olympics has forced World Taekwondo to embrace certain Olympic ideals, such as equal competition for women, making room for those with disabilities, like Para-Olympics, and public service, that is, teaching, for instance, people living in refugee camps Taekwondo. You have to do this to maintain your Olympic status, so whether you wanted to do it or not, you've got to do it if you want to stay at the Olympics. Moreover, these days, in the international world, Taekwondo is changing further. Let us be reflective and try to choose the changes instead of having them just come at us willy-nilly. So I thank you for your time.
Thank you. We'll go next to a presentation by Dr. Spencer Bennington. The prejudice are from North America, so it's very difficult to travel, so they always send us their recorded presentations. Dr. Bennington is a visiting instructor at the University of South Florida, and his presentation is entitled The Embodied Rhetorics of Olympic Taekwondo Sparring.
I'm thankful for Monique's 2015 historical analysis of the ways in which Taekwondo was transformed from Korean karate into an international Olympic combat sport, largely by the persuasive discourse of the state. And I'm fascinated by the ways in which scholars like Gillis 2016 connect this discourse to underlying political tensions. I believe the ways we choose to talk about Taekwondo gives our martial art meaning. But I believe the ways in which we perform Taekwondo conveys meaning as well. In fact, I go so far as to say that individual techniques contain or embody arguments. Martial arts spokespeople in media, like movies or training manuals, certainly make explicit, persuasive arguments about martiality, fighting styles, and origin stories. But what about the techniques themselves? Can a roundhouse kick itself be rhetorical? I certainly believe so. As Ben Spatz reminds us, technique is simply, quote, knowledge that structures practice. As we all know, however, knowledge is very rarely stable or agreed upon, even in small disciplinary communities. Part of the reason we're gathered for this conference is to share research in order to create or transform our collective knowledge of Taekwondo. The art itself is divided into various organizations which all prioritize, propagate, and or dismiss various bits of technical knowledge, thus structuring their practice of Taekwondo slightly differently. If knowledge is contested to the point that practice differs from one disciplinary community to the next, even slightly, then the techniques themselves become argumentative. The idea that a physical, athletic technique or system of practice can have a reciprocal and recursive relationship with rhetorical theory or argument is not my own. Deborah Hawkey's 2004 book, Bodily Arts, provides a detailed account of the ways in which rhetoric was embodied through athletic and martial practice during the age of the first Olympics in ancient Greece. Here, when I say the word rhetoric, I prefer to use contemporary theorist Wayne C. Booth's definition, quote, the entire range of resources human beings share to produce effects on one another. Classically, rhetoric and athletics were always intertwined. Hawkey, 2004, describes how ancient gymnasia, like the Greek Lyceum, often treated the education of the body as synonymous with the education of the mind. As she points out, a citizen of the polis must exhibit a type of, quote, bodily intelligence that extends and adapts to a variety of new situations. She combines the term metis, usually translated as, quote, lively intelligence, derived from the name of Zeus's first wife, a shapeshifter, and hexis, typically meaning a stable state or disposition maintained by a series of habits, to describe the Greek notion of developing a bodily habit practice of mental and rhetorical flexibility, adaptability, and cunning. Embodying this idea of metis hexis became the ultimate goal for Olympic wrestlers looking to escape a submission, as well as statesmen arguing a case in a court of law. This is just one example of how concepts from rhetorical training become adopted by the body in practical ways, but the reverse was also true. Hawkey describes how the conjunction of martial arts like pancration or boxing and philosophy lectures were reciprocally responsible for a development of rhetorical concepts like kairos, or opportune timing. According to Hawkey, the ancient Greeks viewed the kairotic body as one that, through training, was just as adept at countering a punch as it would be an argument. In other words, the ancient Greek tethering of rhetorical theory and athleticism is, in many ways, a chicken and egg relationship. That is to say, one might ask which came first, the shoulder throw or the syllogism, the counterpoint or the counterpunch. Of course, ancient Greek athletics embodied ancient Greek cultural ideas. But as I began to plot out the trajectory of my dissertation research, I wondered if this concept holds true in other cultures and in other time periods. This led me to investigate the ways in which ancient Chinese rhetorics and philosophy, particularly those extending from the Confucian and Taoist schools of thought, were combined with physical culture. Ultimately, I investigated the connections between Taoist cosmology, as described in the I Ching, and the Taekwondo of the 20th century. I wanted to know how Taekwondo masters described concepts like the principles of Padway in practitioner manuals, how these cultural arguments about human behavior were connected to discrete techniques in the Bumse, and how the practice of these techniques facilitated the development of interpersonal skills like creativity, confidence, or enthusiasm in the student. Just like in Pompey's analysis, Taekwondo features a bidirectional and recursive relationship between rhetoric and bodies. Ideas and arguments affect the production or employment of one's body, just as the body can produce or transform ideas and lend itself to arguments. In completing this project, I realized that discrete techniques in Taekwondo Kumse convey arguments, at least in some capacity. I believe all martial arts represent a set of cultural arguments communicated through the body. Taekwondo and other martial arts that utilize forms or patterns for solo practice certainly make arguments through technique and prescribed ways that can be taught, standardized, and concretized through discourse and media like training manuals. But what about the many other manifestations of Taekwondo? Do activities like board breaking, demonstration routines, and Olympic sparring all operate rhetorically as well? I believe that they do. In order to understand how, I'd like to share a heuristic with you that I use for analyzing the three recursive participants that typically make up what's labeled as the rhetorical situation: purpose, audience, and design. I understand that many manifestations of Taekwondo to be rhetorical and that they have been purposely invented, designed, and iterated for an intended audience in response to or situated within some kind of socio-political exigency. Understanding the rhetorical situation provides researchers with useful questions to ask of any martial art when trying to uncover how it might produce effects for various audiences. These questions can be organized by the three recursive participants. Questions of purpose might include: what is the intended effect, action, or outcome? What evidence supports this? Who gets to decide its purpose? What is their positionality and or level of privilege? What is their relationship to or power dynamic with the intended or unintended audiences? Questions of audience might include: who is intentionally or unintentionally affected by this design? What's their demographic makeup? What's the relationship or power dynamic with the speaker, author, rhetor, designer, etc.? And in what capacity are audiences affected? What evidence demonstrates this? Questions of design might include: what has been invented, created, or iterated? What are its defining characteristics? What choices went into this design? How do those choices impact its development and reception? And how might changes to this design produce different effects on target audiences? Of course, it's also important to know how to evaluate the context of a rhetorical situation. The following questions interrogate the chronospatial dimensions, historical positioning, and underlying exigency of rhetorical situations. Questions of context might include: to what extent is there a cultural, political, social urgency, exigency, or impetus for the design? How might historical events or cultural memory affect some audience's reception of the design? And what is the occasion or expected decorum? Is the design timely and responsive to expected genres? These questions lie at the foundation of any rhetorical analysis, and I believe they can help martial arts researchers defamiliarize themselves with their objects of study, as Owen 2019 advocates in his book, Deconstructing Martial Arts. Today, I want to briefly discuss some of the ways this diagram and its associated questions might help us understand Taekwondo's debut as an Olympic combat sport, and how its prominence on the world stage contributes to various embodied rhetorics both on the level of media spectacle and individual technique. When analyzing the rhetorical effect of broadcasting Taekwondo sparring to the world in 1988, it's useful to consider questions of purpose. Primarily, what was the intended effect, action, or outcome? And who got to decide this purpose? What was their positionality and level of privilege? The plan to bring the 24th Olympic Games to Seoul, with Taekwondo featured as an exhibition event, according to Ha and Mangu in 2002, were certainly aligned with Park Chung-hee's view of the national sports movement as a militaristic nationalist movement, one where the best Korean athletes served as, quote, warriors, symbolizing the vitality, self-respect, and self-confidence of the nation on an international stage. Park and his ministers wanted the opportunity for a grand unveiling of their newly reconstructed nation, one similar to the kind of spectacle seen in the 1964 Tokyo Olympics. Like Japan before them, the Korean government would capitalize on their opportunity to host the 1988 Olympics as a way to demonstrate to the world their economic revival. Larson and Park in 1993 go so far as to describe the Seoul Olympics as a type of international political communication, a way to legitimize the ROC's military dictatorship. On the granular bodily level, Taekwondo forwarded this argument as well, much like judo, sumo wrestling, and kendo served as symbols of Japanese martial prowess in 1964. Next, I asked questions of design regarding Taekwondo sparring. Some of these include, what exactly has been invented, created, or iterated, and what are its defining characteristics? What choices went into this design, and how do those choices impact its development and reception? By this point in Taekwondo history, the martial art had started to become more than just a vehicle for propaganda or a self-defense system adapted from Japanese styles. As Mona 2015 presents in great detail, this time period is one where Taekwondo finally began to form a unique identity through the rapid technical development of the combat sport. The combination of new protective gear, the introduction of full contact continuous fighting, and rules against hand strikes to the head were the first catalysts for this evolution, but many more changes would come in rapid succession. By 1988, Taekwondo was visually distinct enough to capture the hearts and minds of spectators worldwide with its lightning-fast kicks and powerful knockout techniques. As a result of its growing popularity and Kim Young's tireless lobbying efforts, Taekwondo became an official medal sport in 2000. Understanding embodied rhetorics as they manifest in contemporary Taekwondo sparring is as simple as looking at the current graduated scoring system for significant strikes. The differential between a single point for a punch to the body and 5 points awarded for a turning kick to the head indicates that the practice of Taekwondo rewards more challenging, dynamic strikes. In this way, the techniques demonstrated at the Olympic level make arguments about combat sports in general. They are spectacles for audiences looking for exciting, dramatic competitions, as well as skill-testing arenas for athletes. This argument is quite different from what is embodied in other Olympic combat sports like judo or boxing, and quite different indeed from the focus of pure pragmatism in competitions like the UFC. When I look at Olympic sparring, I see an argument about one way to discuss and understand Taekwondo. It is a complex game of speed and timing, one where competitors are rewarded for taking risks and executing difficult techniques. Of course, this is but one facet of Taekwondo, an art that means many things to many different people. But it is also one of the most highly publicized iterations, perhaps the dominant lens through which the international public views it. For this, I'm actually grateful. Of the many varieties of Taekwondo practice, I feel the contemporary iteration of sport sparring is the best equipped to embody arguments that are not necessarily tied to nationalism, racial superiority, or violent dominance. And I've talked briefly about quite a few subjects today, so I wanted to recap some of the points that I think are most important. First, the ways we choose to talk about Taekwondo gives our martial art meaning, but the ways in which we perform Taekwondo conveys meaning as well. Individual techniques contain or embody arguments. 2. Booth's definition of rhetoric is, quote, the entire range of resources human beings share to produce effects on one another. And it's this definition that I think is most important for understanding how exactly martial arts can be rhetorical. 3. I understand the many manifestations of Taekwondo to be rhetorical in that they have been purposely invented, designed, and iterated for an intended audience in response to or situated within some kind of socio-political exigency. 4. Taekwondo embodies Taoist, Confucian, Zen, and nationalist rhetorics in Pumse, But certain cultural arguments are also present in other forms of practice. 5. Olympic sparring embodies arguments about how to prioritize and reward training through the graduated scoring system, rules that prohibit hand strikes to the head, and penalties for falling down. These rules and other factors affect the way athletes train and perform the art to the point that it hardly resembles what it looked like in 19. In many ways, I think this is a good thing. Taekwondo is starting to become truly shared and iterated by multiple audiences internationally, instead of tightly controlled by a singular government or political group. I look forward to discussing these ideas with you further as our conference approaches. Thank you so much for your attention.
Let's welcome Dr. Lewis with applause.
I'm guessing most of you don't know what Lacanian means. I will try and explain that simply today. Martial arts can be arranged on a spectrum from esoteric spirituality or myths and legends on the one hand to practical combatives and real-life violence on the other end. From expressions of intangible cultural heritage to self-defense. Often such divergent aspects may be present in a single martial art, hence it can be difficult to understand how different parts of a martial art fit together in a coherent whole. The three orders theory of French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan may offer a paradigm theorizing about martial arts. Now, I must confess that I am not an expert on Lacan and I am not a psychoanalyst. Rather, I am appropriating his idea and definitely simplifying it. But I think it can be useful to organize our understanding of martial arts and in particular Taekwondo pedagogy. One of Lacan's pivotal ideas, which crystallized over many years, is that of the imaginary, symbolic, and real. I believe that Lacan's orders of the imaginary, symbolic, and real can function as a good framework to think about Taekwondo, similar to my previous framework that I used, such as the low variables to high variables sparring drill paradigm, which I shared at the 2019 iACT at Stanford University as part of my paper on the teleology of sparring in ITF Taekwondo. I'm starting my theory with some assumptions, and that is that the purpose, or at least a purpose of martial arts, is preparation for surviving real violence, in other words, self-defense. There are, of course, many other goals that martial arts systems might have, such as personal development, health and well-being, competition, and so on, which I will not focus on today. I think Dr. Paul Bowman will elaborate on this notion later today in his presentation about how to talk about Taekwondo. Today, I will start from the assumption that the goal of Taekwondo is self-defense. Since this is at least one definition found within Taekwondo literature, it claims to be the Korean art of self-defense. How successful Taekwondo is at self-defense, that is another matter. So let me return now to this idea of Jacques Lacan, of the three orders theory. I will briefly describe what I mean, or what he means by imaginary, symbolic, and real, and in each case, I will make an application to martial arts. Let's begin with the imaginary. Imaginary refers to how we imagine ourselves and others to be. It refers to our worldview, the way we see and interpret reality. Lacan's idea of the imaginary is equated with the mirror stage in child development, when an infant between 6 months and 18 months of age starts to recognize that it is the object it sees in the mirror. This, the psychoanalysts argued, is when the ego is formed, and it resonates with Freud's concept of identification. The child looks up at its parents and siblings and identifies in them an ideal ego, a kind of future ego it hopes to become. The mirror can therefore be understood metaphorically, so that there need not be an actual mirror. The child may see themselves reflected in other children or their siblings or adults. In his later thought, Lacan did not restrict the mirror stage only to the infant, but extended it into adulthood as something that continues throughout our lives. I propose that in the martial arts, the imaginary is the image we have about what a martial artist is, what someone who is practicing martial arts is like. Note that I'm emphasizing both the act of martial arts practice as an object and the person engaging in it as a subject. In modern times, this image is highly influenced by popular media. The image of a martial artist may be based on myths of Shaolin monk warriors, Zen practicing samurai, characters in film like Daniel LaRusso and Mr. Miyagi in The Karate Kid, the many characters played by Jean-Claude Van Damme, Jackie Chan, Jet Li, Donnie Yen, and Michelle Yeoh. Of course, the imagined martial artist need not stay within the realm of Hollywood and East Asian cinema, but can also be based on combat athletes from WWE or UFC, or actual historical figures such as Masuyama and Bruce Lee. Finally, for most martial arts initiates, their most immediate image of what a martial artist is often their personal martial arts instructor or their seniors. It is not for naught that in Korean, the term for instructor, sabonim, literally translates as a teacher to be imitated. In all these cases, we have a type of idealized or an idealization of the martial artist. In other words, it is a fantasy. Sometimes martial arts instructors, masters, grandmasters, may unfortunately promote this fantasy of themselves, but often the students themselves idealize their instructors. The idealization may simply be the result of a perceived, and correctly so, gap, and a big gap between the student and their instructor's skill level. This gap, which at first may seem quite insurmountable, causes the student to put the instructor on a pedestal. This ideal then functions as a goal to strive for. And while it may be a fantasy, it is not wholly bad. Myths and fantasies can be inspirational. Hence, martial arts philosopher Allan Bäck, Professor Bäck, who presented earlier, just before me, he presented a paper in favor of myths in martial arts last year at the iACT conference. There is, of course, a danger that the fantasy may be mistaken for reality. Many new martial arts artists are lured into taking up the martial arts because of what they saw in a Hollywood movie, maybe of a lone hero that beat up a gang, or other impossible feats. Such a false sense of prowess can be quite dangerous. Now let's move on to the real. The real is on the other end of Lacan's spectrum. It is a bit tricky to give a simple definition of what Lacan meant by the real, but for our purpose, I propose we understand it simply as what is objective before interpretation. What is reality before we interpret it? Or as Lacan defined it in one of his many definitions, the real is what does not depend on my idea of it. In other words, reality before it is filtered by our senses and our world views. This means that the real is never fully knowable because our subjective interpretation skews objective reality. Furthermore, the real is too complex to be fully understood. For our discussion on martial arts, we will refer here to what happens during actual violence. What is a real violent encounter like? How do trained practitioners really act during violent encounters? How do an untrained person act in such circumstances? How is the human nervous system affected by stress and adrenaline during violent conflict? How are muscle control and coordination affected? How is competition fighting different from a street fight, both strategically and psychologically? How is a duel, such as a street fight, a squabble at a pub, a brawl on the playground, different from a predatory criminal attack on an unsuspecting victim? Some of these questions can, to a lesser or greater degree, be studied, and there are professionals in military, security and defense occupations who have taken the time to attempt to address some of these questions. The problem is, however, that even when we have analyzed the data, the subjective lived experience of violence is different from person to person and from violent encounter to violent encounter. One simply cannot predict all the variables that come into play during a violent encounter. One cannot know when exactly you will be attacked, whether the floor will be hard or slippery, whether it will be in the dark, whether there will be weapons involved, how many attackers there will be, and so on. At the best, we can hope for an approximation of likely possibilities. Moving on to the symbolic order. Lacan's symbolic refers to all the societal institutions and systems that are in place to mediate between the imaginary and the real.
Lacanian framework of Taekwondo practice. Let's welcome Dr. Lewis with applause.
I'm guessing most of you don't know what Lacanian means. I will try and explain that simply today. Martial arts can be arranged on a spectrum from esoteric spirituality or myths and legends on the one hand to practical combatives and real-life violence on the other end, from expressions of intangible cultural heritage to self-defense. Often such divergent aspects may be present in a single martial art. Hence, it can be difficult to understand how different parts of a martial art fit together in a coherent whole. The three orders theory of French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan may offer a paradigm theorizing about martial arts. Now, I must confess that I am not an expert on Lacan and I am not a psychoanalyst. Rather, I am approaching simplifying it, but I think it can be useful to organize our understanding of martial arts and in particular Taekwondo pedagogy. One of Lacan's pivotal ideas, which crystallized over many years, is that of the imaginary, symbolic, and real. I believe that Lacan's orders of the imaginary, symbolic, and real can function as a good framework to think about Taekwondo, similar to my previous framework that I used, such as the low variables to high variables sparring drill paradigm, which I shared at the 2019 iACT at Stanford University as part of my paper on the teleology of sparring in ITA Taekwondo. I'm starting my theory with some assumptions, and that is that the purpose, or at least a purpose of martial arts, is preparation for surviving real violence, in other words, self-defense. There are, of course, many other goals that martial arts systems might have, such as personal development, health and well-being, competition, and so on, which I will not focus on today. I think Dr. Paul Bowman will elaborate on this notion later today in his presentation about how to talk about Taekwondo. Today, I will start from the assumption that the goal of Taekwondo is self-defense. Since this is at least one definition found within Taekwondo literature, it claims to be the Korean art of self-defense. How successful Taekwondo is at self-defense, that is another matter. So let me return now to this idea of Jacques Lacan of the three orders theory. I will briefly describe what I mean, or what he means by imaginary, symbolic, and real, and in each case, I will make an application to martial arts. Let's begin with the imaginary. Imaginary refers to how we imagine ourselves and others to be. It refers to our worldview, the way we see and interpret reality. Lacan's idea of the imaginary is equated with the mirror stage in child development, when an infant between 6 months and 18 months of age starts to recognize that it is the object it sees in the mirror. This, the psychoanalysts argued, is when the ego is formed, and it resonates with Freud's concept of identification. The child looks up at its parents and siblings and identifies in them an ideal ego, a kind of future ego it hopes to become. The mirror can therefore be understood metaphorically, so that there need not be an actual mirror. The child may see themselves reflected in other children or their siblings or adults. In his later thought, Lacan did not restrict the mirror stage only to the infant, but extended it into adulthood as something that continues throughout our lives. I propose that in the martial arts, the imaginary is the image we have about what a martial artist is, what someone who is practicing martial arts is like. Note that I'm emphasizing both the act of martial arts practice as an object and the person engaging in it as a subject. In modern times, this image is highly influenced by popular media. The image of a martial artist may be based on myths of Shaolin monk warriors, Zen practicing samurai, characters in film like Daniel LaRusso and Mr. Miyagi in The Karate Kid, the many characters played by Jean-Claude Van Damme, Jackie Chan, Jet Li, Donnie Yen, and Michelle Yeoh. Of course, the imagined martial artist need not stay within the realm of Hollywood and East Asian cinema, but can also be based on combat athletes from WWE or UFC, or actual historical figures such as Masuyama and Bruce Lee. martial arts initiates, their most immediate image of what a martial artist is often their personal martial arts instructor or their seniors. It is not for naught that in Korean, the term for instructor, sabonim, literally translates as a teacher to be imitated. In all these cases, we have a type of idealized or an idealization of the martial artist. In other words, it is a fantasy. Sometimes martial arts instructors, masters, grandmasters, may unfortunately promote this fantasy of themselves, but often the students themselves idealize their instructors. The idealization may simply be the result of a perceived, and correctly so, gap, and a big gap between the student and their instructor's skill level. This gap, which at first may seem quite insurmountable, causes the student to put the instructor on a pedestal. This ideal then functions as a goal to strive for. And while it may be a fantasy, it is not wholly bad. Myths and fantasies can be inspirational. Hence, martial arts philosopher Allan Bäck, Professor Bäck, who presented earlier, just before me, he presented a paper in favor of myths in martial arts last year at the iACT conference. There is, of course, a danger that the fantasy may be mistaken for reality. Many new martial artists are lured into taking up the martial arts because of what they saw in a Hollywood movie, maybe of a lone hero that beat up a gang, or other impossible feats. Such a false sense of prowess can be quite dangerous. Now let's move on to the real. The real is on the other end of Lacan's spectrum. It is a bit tricky to give a simple definition of what Lacan meant by the real, but for our purpose, I propose we understand it simply as what is objective before interpretation. What is reality before we interpret it? Or as Lacan defined it in one of his many definitions, the real is what does not depend on my idea of it. In other words, reality before it is filtered by our senses and our world views. This means that the real is never fully knowable because our subjective interpretation skews objective reality. Furthermore, the real is too complex to be fully understood. For our discussion on martial arts, we will refer here to what happens during actual violence. What is a real violent encounter like? How do trained practitioners really act during violent encounters? How do an untrained person act in such circumstances? How is the human nervous system affected by stress and adrenaline during violent conflict? How are muscle control and coordination affected? How is competition fighting different from a street fight, both strategically and psychologically? How is a duel, such as a street fight, a squabble at a pub, a brawl on the playground, different from a predatory criminal attack on an unsuspecting victim? Some of these questions can, to a lesser or greater degree, be studied, and there are professionals in military, security and defense occupations who have taken the time to attempt to address some of these questions. The problem is, however, that even when we have analyzed the data, the subjective lived experience of violence is different from person to person and from violent encounter to violent encounter. One simply cannot predict all the variables that come into play during a violent encounter. One cannot know when exactly you will be attacked, whether the floor will be hard or slippery, whether it will be in the dark, whether there will be weapons involved, how many attackers there will be, and so on. At the best, we can hope for an approximation of likely possibilities. Moving on to the symbolic order. Lacan's symbolic refers to all the societal institutions and systems that are in place to mediate between the imaginary and the real. For example, in a country that sees itself as a safe democracy, such systems may include a government and judiciary that ensures regular, free and fair elections. In the martial arts context, I propose that the symbolic is the martial arts system with its syllabus and training practices and associated institutions. The proper martial arts system functions as a conduit for understanding and preparing for the real, for real violence. The system ought to help disillusion the martial arts practitioner from the imaginary, from the Hollywood depictions of martial arts. As the practitioner is training in the martial arts system, they learn to distinguish between the imaginary and the real. They learn that the cinematic depictions of martial arts are simply fantasy. Yet they also realize that the abilities of their instructors and seniors are not mystical, but simply the result of hard, persistent, and awfully long training. And I am almost finished. So let's apply these three orders theory. In summary, we are talking about a martial art that wants to be a self-defense system, such as Taekwondo claims to be. So first, such a martial art system should be disillusioned of the imaginary. Whenever a martial arts system promotes wrong ideas of what a real violent encounter is like, or even teaching practical techniques or strategies for facing real violence, it is failing to discover the falsehoods in the imaginary and is rather strengthening the imaginary. Second, a good martial arts system should provide a sensible path towards preparing for the real and real violence. There should be a proper pedagogy, a syllabus in place that can guide the practitioner from being completely unprepared for real violence to be reasonably prepared for the real. It is important to note that to be absolutely prepared for the real is impossible, because the real is impossible to fully predict and comprehend. Even the most experienced combatants are not successful 100% of the time. Real violence is simply too chaotic and unpredictable. Nevertheless, one can train to improve your chances. A good martial arts system should have a progressive syllabus that aims towards the most likely success. This should include what is now commonly called reality-based training against resisting partners. Third, the imaginary is not without value. A good martial arts system engages the imaginary in a productive way to inspire the student to grow beyond themselves, beyond their current physical abilities, towards an ideal. Mastery in the martial arts may result in a practitioner doing feats that appear fantastical. However, this is the result of years of hard work and dedication. When a practitioner sees their instructors do such skills, it can inspire the practitioner to want to achieve the same level as their instructor or their seniors, and maybe even improve beyond the level of their own instructors. Therefore, the imaginary has an important motivating function. And finally, because it is impossible to definitively prepare for the real, the ultimate training goal is a type of unattainable ideal. This is where the imaginary plays an important function as well. The imaginary provides an impossible or idealistic goal, and that is the goal of perfection of technique, which is aimed for in martial arts. Without this drive towards the perfect technique, the martial artist could never aim high enough to prepare for the impossibility of the real. Preparing for the real is impossible, and striving towards the impossible ideal, towards perfect technique, is also impossible, yet it is this striving towards that impossible ideal, towards perfect technique, that best prepares the martial artist for the real and for real violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lloyd. For this roundtable discussion is the presenters of the session 1, and three of them will be joining us using Zoom. Okay, I think everybody is joining us now. So I'd like to begin the discussion session with Professor Dziwenka. If he has anything to add on his presentation or make a comment or other questions, I'd like to give each presenters a chance to speak first. Then if you have a time left over, there are global audiences who also ask questions, so maybe we can get to that. So, Dr. Dziwenka, do you have anything to add in your presentation?
Yeah, I have some things to say. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So, fundamentally, the ITF and IOC and WT have been applying Taekwondo as an instrument for peace in the last couple of years. I think the ITF and General Chiang have been much more consistent with how they have used Taekwondo as an instrument for peace than the WT has. When we had our conference in 2016 in San Francisco, we put the nail in the coffin of the old ways of looking at history of Taekwondo that the WT and Kukiwan have been presenting for a number of decades. We got rid of all of those old misconceptions. So I think the WT and Kukiwan have been looking for another way to make use of Taekwondo, and their alliance with the ICF has given them this avenue of aligning with IOC, with ICF, and with history. So my conceptualization of using very well-known text, the Great Learning, is well-known in all of the Asian cultures and countries. This text was a basis for the national exam, a basis for government service, studied by scholars and scholarly officials for the last couple of 100 years. And of course, the Joseon Dynasty has taken the mantle of Confucianism away from China, and Korea has become much more of a Confucian country than Korea. So I think that this use of this text, which offers a structure for the fundamental basis of individual development, which is investigating things. We can choose whatever we want to investigate, but that investigation has to be internal, introspection, through some external action, whether it be Olympic Taekwondo, whether it be self-defense, whether it be any kind of use of Taekwondo. And for, as the text states, it's for the ultimate goal of world peace. I think the IOC, WT, and ITF can make use of this practice to this ultimate goal of world peace. I think the ITF has done a better job than WC in that regard, but let's see what other people have to say.
Thank you very much. I think everyone has questions and comments, but let us go through each one of our presenters first, because we have such a tight schedule. So next, I'd like to turn the mic to Professor Allan Bäck. If you have any
I'll be very short. If you really want to investigate Taekwondo as a cultural practice, I suggested that you have to look at the actual history of where the Taekwondo code and so-called philosophy, which I don't think is philosophy, but I said that already, come from. And that requires doing actual empirical work about how what Koreans actually learn in various countries, particularly Japan. And the only other thing I would say is that there's a big difference, I think, between Koreans who practice Taekwondo in Korea and Koreans in the rest of the world, where they were exposed more to a society which is not so homogenous. That is, they have to be exposed to the other martial arts and the other traditions, for example, a lot more outside Korea than inside Korea. So it makes, pardon my saying this, but it makes the Koreans who do Taekwondo inside Korea a bit more insular, although a lot of the Koreans inside Korea do travel and understand what's going on. So I think the future research that we have to do if we really want to be serious about figuring out the cultural significance, so-called spiritual side of Taekwondo, whether it's originally Korean or not, we have to do the research and see who learned what where.
Okay, thank you. Next, Dr. Bennington, do you have I would like to have you make any comments or?
Yes, thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to be here with everyone. I've really enjoyed the conference so far. I'll just summarize some of my major points. I believe that Taekwondo, like all martial arts, are rhetorical in that they communicate cultural arguments through the body. And that was sort of the main thesis that I was trying to put forward today. When I say that cultural arguments are communicated through the body, I mean that on the level of technique. I use Vince Spatz's idea that technique is knowledge which structures practice. So with my background in rhetorical studies, my first question is, whose knowledge? Who came up with that knowledge? Whose interpretation is guiding that knowledge? And so today I was trying to share with you a few ways that you might answer those questions by looking at questions of purpose, audience, and design for basic rhetorical understanding of some Taekwondo techniques. Of course, Taekwondo is interesting as a martial art because its techniques manifest in very different contexts. Most of my research has been done on the level of Homsei, but today I wanted to extend that argument a little bit to what we see when we tune in to watch Olympic-style sparring, and to ask the question, what exactly is being communicated to the world about Taekwondo on a technical level when we watch those matches? What does that say about the future direction of the sport compared to some of the history that we've already started talking about in Japan? So I look forward to discussing that more with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. They are all very interesting points. Joyce?
My presentation today matches a theme that I've been exploring related to the presentation I gave last year at the Sanko conference. And the theme is self-defense. Taekwondo claims to be a martial art that teaches self-defense. And my argument is simple. If it's going to claim to teach self-defense, it should be sensible self-defense techniques and sensible strategies that are based in reality and not in fantasy. So basically, I'm just saying, good, it's okay if Taekwondo wants to have that goal of teaching self-defense or preparing somebody for self-defense practice, but if it's going to do that, then the things that it teach, both the practical techniques and also the theory related to self-defense, should match reality, should match latest research in self-defense practice. And there are research being done on this matter, as I mentioned, within the military, within combat and security fields of study as well. So we should incorporate that. In today's presentation, I also add a slightly more esoteric idea, and that is working towards an ideal. And this is kind of in a philosophical sense that martial arts, traditional martial arts especially, has the sense of perfection, and we are striving to perfect our technique. And again, I would say here that is an honorable thing to do, and I agree with it, but the techniques that we strive to perfect should then also be sensible, practical techniques that can be applied in a real violent situation, and not techniques that are maybe purely aesthetic or traditional.
Thank you very much. Today's conference is very apparent-based conference on YouTube. So before we open up the questions to the floor, I'd like to ask Dr. Johnson to put forward a couple more questions on YouTube.
So the first question that was posed from our global audience comes actually from the Zoom feed, and it is from Ms. Phoebe Grenfield in the UK. And her question is to Dr. Dziwenka. She asked, why did General Che use Taoism and Confucianism for ITF moral culture? Was this a conscious decision, or was it more culturally based?
So my response is it was both. He consciously chose that, and it is part of the culture. But the culture came from Japan. Of course, the methodology that he chose was based on Kano's application of Neo-Confucian conceptualization of using Do as an ethical way of life, and apply that to Judo. Cheong, he applied that to Taekwondo. But as Dr. Kingsner pointed out in his research a number of times, this kind of model of applicability of Taekwondo to some kind of political activity led to a repetition of a narrative that was useful in constructing an ethnocentric and nationalist ideology. According to Dr. Bowman, narrative knowledge is power. The narrative that is designed from the position of those in power, like the WT or IACT. Knowledge legitimates that narrative, and knowledge is used in that narrative used for political gains or political activity.
Thank you, sir.
I always say that Kano got a lot of his ideals from Kubra's hand, and then transferred them to the Japanese.
Yes, but as I said in my presentation, he just like in the comprehensive illustrated manual of martial arts, its introduction was an assortment of a hodgepodge of phrases, wisdom from different Chinese philosophical sources. It didn't have any sense. So my presentation showed that even Xiaoyi applied a hodgepodge of sometimes very well-used philosophical aspects of different Neo-Confucian thinkers, but he also made some wrong interpretation and application. So limited understanding of East Asian culture, but a need to use that to validate Taekwondo practice or Taekwondo as a political force, made so that somebody with limited understanding didn't use what I think is the core essence of Neo-Confucianism, which is the Great Learning. It is the fundamental basis of all the things that He tried to say, starting from individual quest for investigation of things, introspectively, to develop morals, to the final goal of world peace. That Great Learning is the fundamental basis of all of the different Neo-Confucian texts that he refers to.
I disagree with what you said.
Sorry, Dr. Bäck, could you please repeat that? Okay.
I don't disagree with what you said. It's just that this is a Cooper's element that is subconsciously adopted by China. It's pretty clear from the historical record.
And I agree with that also as well.
Great. Thank you. The next question is coming from Master Justin Castillo in the United States. And this is directed to Dr. Bennington. He asks, what are good examples of movements in Taekwondo Kumse that serve a rhetorical purpose of history, culture, and nationalism?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me okay? All right, sorry, the audio cut out there just for a second, but I did think the question. Thank you, it's a good question. I think when we start to think about Kumse, I would look back at General Che's original forms and say that not so much on the technical level, but this is one of the first places where we see a dedicated symbolic meaning for cultural, historical, Korean identity in other forms, particularly the number of mythological and sort of historical characters that many forms are named after. I will say that my expertise is more in the sort of next stage when we transition to the Agwe and Bäck Kumse, which we then see a technical shift. So on the physical level, you'll notice that many of the stances are higher. A lot of the more traditional techniques that are visually synonymous with Japanese styles have been changed or altered in some way, particularly for, I would say, nationalistic reasons to make things look, quote, more Korean. And of course, you mentioned Kungang as an example. And so once we get out of the first 8 forms of Agwe system, which are, as I mentioned, tied to the trigrams and the chain, the black belt Kumse are very interesting because the way a practitioner has to move on the floor is tracing these Chinese symbols. So in Koryo, for a learned scholar, Kungang, mountain, so on and so forth. So the way that you're moving your body is in fact writing a character or a symbol for this underlying idea that you should be performing. Grandmaster Richard Chung also has some interesting interpretations for some of the black belt Kumse, particularly in Koryo, what he calls the barrel pushing ready stance. It goes by many names. But he states in his memoir that that is a way of embodying not only spirit, and what you're doing is pushing against an immovable object. So those are some of the ways that I would suggest that the Kumse in particular embody form cultural, political, historical arguments.
Does Dr. Kumse, Dr. Tongay also train characters of reform?
My understanding, so they do. My investigation has primarily been in the first 8, where the symbols that you're seeing.
Yeah, those traits the diagrams of the Tongay set.
They do. It's that eye-shaped pattern, though, so you can't really. The distinction, of course, is to get the broken and unbroken lines that's all about out in one term. So yes, you're correct.
from Dr. Bäck to Dr. Lewis.
Can't hear you.
Is this better?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. So this question is now to Dr. Lewis from Dr. Bäck, asked in the chat form. He says, Taekwondo having reality-based training strikes us very similar to an MMA style pedagogy. Why not just use more effective self-defense, like guns? Why do we even have Taekwondo?
I've heard this argument, and maybe from the Int'l in one of his writings as well. I come from South Africa. South Africa is not like many parts of the world where it's really safe. Like when I came to Korea the first time and I started teaching self-defense, the Koreans told me, "Why are you so violent?" And I couldn't understand it until I lived here for a while and realized, yes, the things I teach is not applicable to this society at all. But where I come from in South Africa, where an encounter with crime can kill you, there it is relevant to have actual practical self-defense. So it depends on where you live. So in some places, yeah, you don't need that, and you can easily use a gun, maybe. If you live in America, where you can buy a gun and move on. In other places, it's not like that. There are certain countries where owning a gun is not an easy thing, and you don't always have your gun with you when you are suddenly attacked, and the purpose is to kill you for whatever reason. So I think there is still value for martial arts practiced as self-defense and not just as a sport or spiritual growth or some other aesthetic self-expression. So, and many people, and especially where I come from, South Africa, people often join martial arts for the goal of learning self-defense, not simply for fitness or for self-expression or so on. So that would be my reply. So I guess it's contextual. It depends where you're from and what you need it for.
Even in South Africa, I don't object to what you say. I'm not in favor of learning this technique. But I think then we should expand the repertoire. We talk about knives, we talk about hammers, we talk about screwdrivers, and yes, guns. But if you only want to teach someone about that, you would have to extend the repertoire beyond the Taekwondo one.
And to add to that, several of the South African Taekwondo instructors that I know also do gun courses. So they regularly go to the gun range, they learn how to use guns in a proper way. So yeah, it really depends where you are from and what you need.
So we have time for one more question, and this is something I would like to ask Dr. Bäck. In 2017, you explained this during a panel discussion at a different conference, but I think our global audience may have been confused to something you said earlier in the discussion. And you state that Taekwondo philosophy is not actual philosophy. Could you please expound upon that idea?
You're right. People like using the word philosophy quite a lot. In fact, I think it's even a perfume called philosophy. Well, if you want the technical sense, it's a bit different. The reason why I don't think that the precept of the code is philosophy is that you have to do two things to make it philosophy in the sense that I do philosophy. If you just the sense that I do upgrade your philosophy, okay. But you can call it something else if you like. The two things you would have to do, say, to talk about social justice, is you first would have to give criteria for and when someone is actually in a socially just fashion, and when someone is not. And what I complained about at the last meeting we had was, well, why did you have this big commitment to social justice in both ITF and WT? Well, wait a minute, and promoting peace. So, if you're promoting peace and you live in North Korea, and the government kills all these people and puts them in concentration camps, and ITF has done nothing about it, how can you say that you're following the code? So, all right. So, you first have to give me criteria when you're acting in a socially just manner and when you're not. That's number one. And likewise for the other virtues. And the second thing you would have to do is philosophy, the way I do philosophy. And then you would have to give me a theoretical justification for why your criteria is the correct one, based on some kind of moral theory. I've never seen anyone do it. Confucian is hopeless, right? Sorry, because, well, that's the way it was done in the Yellow Emperors. I don't care what the Yellow Emperors did. It was probably, first of all, false history. And second of all, who cares? Right? The question is, what is just? So if you want to do philosophy, as many people have, you have to do those things.
Okay, thank you. I think we have about 5 minutes left, so we have one more question or comments.
Well, I'd like to respond to that. So Neo-Confucianism is quite far away from classical Confucianism. Neo-Confucianism emphasizes the individual's internal introspection in applying that to their investigation of whatever it is they're doing. So Confucianism offers all kinds of activities. Neo-Confucianism offers all kinds of activities that can be done to as the process of introspection, as long as the goal is to be moral. But again, it doesn't say it doesn't define what moral means. So in
even in Neo-Confucianism, I understand what you're going for. I'm teaching it right now. But look, the trouble is, even in Neo-Confucianism, how do they treat women in Neo-Confucian time? Shitty, right? I'm
talking about the text. And as I said, narrative knowledge is power. The misapplication of the principles is the problem politically, not the text itself.
Well, there's some text in Confucius and maybe here Confucius we have unpleasant things to say about women.
Yeah, but I'm talking about the Great Learning, which is the fundamental basis of all Neo-Confucian texts.
It talks about the range of the theory that it basically is sort of summaries of the Amalek, right?
Oh, no, it's an application of individual self-cultivation that is an appropriation from Buddhism and Taoism to the moral cultivation of an individual. So I look at it more as the individual cultivation aspect. But again, that leaves the investigation of things is very broad. It leaves it undetermined. So the text is okay. It's the application of the text that is the problem, I think.
Well, then we still would have to figure out what is moral and what people believe is said to make them know.
That's right. I agree fully with that. There is no clear criteria. But obviously that is decided by whoever is using the text and the Confucian principles for their own gains. It doesn't coincide with what ideal, as Sanko is talking about, striving towards an ideal of something that should be much more codified, as you're pointing out.
Yeah, but some people can strive to assign the evil which is awful. And so we still need to have criteria for when the striving is awful to let it do it.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you very much for the lively discussion. I think we are out of time now. That should wrap up session 1. Thank you very much for joining us by Zoom, Dr. Dziwenka, Dr. Bäck, Dr. Bennington. Thank you again for taking your valuable time for joining us, and thank you for everyone who is present here. This concludes the session 1. We'll take a 1-hour lunch break, and we will resume at 1 p.m. GM Standard Time. Thank you.
We will try to